Thanks very much, Gary. Hello, everyone. Well done for staying the course. Now, I've got to apologize because I forgot to transfer my slides onto this laptop of mine, so I hope you can keep up and carry on with me. I thought that was a very good speech by Robert Adams as well, actually, and when I heard it, I was just recalling Churchill's famous words, first we shape our buildings, then our buildings shape us. And I think, beauty begets beauty, ugliness begets ugliness, and there might be possibly a link there, don't you know? Well done for organising this as well, Gary, and the NCF Locals team. I think this is an excellent event. Now, I'm the last speaker here, and I know it's been a long day as well as fascinating, so I thought I would focus on the first part of the title of this conference, which is a celebration of England. So I want you to consider this segment, How England Made the Modern World, as something like a bit of a prep talk to hopefully, stiffen the sinews and summon up the blood of all good, true-born English men and English women. But as Flanders and Swan said, if you're not true-born, or you're not English, or you're not a man or a woman, just sit there and show some respect and listen intently. Now, I would normally say how Britain made the modern world, because Britain made the modern world, but this conference is about England, and so I'm going to focus really upon England, but of course, Britain's contributions are, of course, just as important. We mustn't forget there's the Scots and the Welsh and the Northern Irish, and I know if this goes on YouTube, there will be Scots and others commenting about why we're just focusing on the English. And we know, obviously, from the Industrial Revolution to the Scottish Enlightenment, all four parts of this country have played an important role. So when I say that England invented the modern world, there's no slight intended, but it is the case that the origins of many of Britain's contributions to the world actually have English origins and in fact are exclusively English in many cases. And also it seems all too often these days to be the case that the English are the only inhabitants of these islands whose celebrations of identity are positively discouraged, if not frowned on. When the Scots and the Welsh wave their saltires and their dragons, it's called progressive nationalism. When the English do it, it's racist. And I remember years ago when Ken Livingstone, mayor of the capital city of England, gave funding for a St. Patrick's Day parade, but refused one for a St. George's Day parade because it was going to be xenophobic and exclusionary. So I think, an unabashed and unashamed celebration of England just barely 3 weeks before St. George's Day is long overdue. Now, it's also true, of course, that, overt displays of patriotism are also were long held as being decidedly un-English, because traditionally an Englishman's patriotism was discreet and it was personal. He may or may not have believed that God is an Englishman, but he certainly subscribed to Cecil Rhodes' great quote, said, "Remember that you are an Englishman and have therefore won first prize in the lottery of life." And so knowing that, they had no need to be patriotic or to boast because they were self-assured. And unfortunately, so self-confident were the English that they, for generations, were very happy to have their greatest achievements, their greatest accomplishments, their greatest qualities and traits woven up into the British national fabric, so that the distinction between English and British became increasingly blurred in a way that you don't find with the Scots and the Welsh. For example, what is the British Constitution? Well, it's an English constitution to which the Scots acceded. And if you go on Google and if you search for a famous figure from English history of the last 300 years, odds are they'll be described as British in a way you won't find with Scottish and Welsh figures of the past. Now, as the English are the dominant force in the Union, the confusion between Britain and England didn't really matter when Britain was a proud nation straddling the globe. But in today's era, when love of nation has been replaced by national self-loathing, I'm afraid this lack of distinction is currently is the source of one of England's greatest identity crises. In my view, therefore, in order to forge a strong English identity, it's necessary to reclaim and proudly celebrate those tremendous gifts that England gave not only Britain, but indeed the world. And I can't think of a more appropriate place to do that than in Salisbury and Wiltshire, which was an inspired choice of yours and the NCF Locals organisers, Gary, because not only is Salisbury Cathedral home, of course, to the finest of the 4 surviving copies of the Magna Carta, Wiltshire can justifiably claim to be the birthplace of England. And that's because the nearby town of Amesbury is the oldest continuous settlement in the country, with evidence of habitation going back 8,800 years. And of course, it's within the parish of Amesbury that you'll find England's most iconic, I suppose the great patriarch of English iconic structures, Stonehenge. Now, The Guardian, thank you. The Guardian said that Amesbury is where English history began. Not for the first time, I disagree slightly with The Guardian on that issue, but it's certainly where English history took root. And my gosh, having taken root, how it blossomed. Because if you actually look at their contributions to global civilization, and I mean global, I don't mean continental influence or regional influence, I would argue that 2 countries have had a greater impact on the globe than any other. Those are England and Italy, or what we now call modern Italy, because Italy actually is a fairly recent creation. But from the ancient world through to the Renaissance and Europe's great leap forward in art and architecture, in beauty, in science, medicine, innovation, as well as the rise of capitalism, the Italians and their city-states profoundly influenced and shaped the foundations of Western civilization, which in turn shaped the world. But we're not talking about the Italians, we're talking about the English. So how did England make the modern world? Well, we don't have time to enumerate them all now, but there are 10 contributions that I like to set aside as being truly exceptional. And to tie us directly into today's conference, we'll start with the first global contribution to civilization of the English, and that's liberty and the rights of Englishmen, as it used to be known. As one 19th century writer said, "Our liberty is neither Greek nor Roman, but essentially English. It has a character of its own, a character which takes a tinge from the sentiments of the chivalrous ages and which accords with our peculiarities, our manners, and our insular position." English liberty is different from the traditional idea of Greek and Roman liberty, which are focused much more on civic participation and the absence of domination. English liberty emphasizes the rule of law, due process, and the guarantee of equal rights of the individual. And it's that concept of English liberty, or as it used to be called, the fundamental rights of Englishmen, that has spread around the world. And it's inspired nations to break free from oppression, created constitutions that safeguard personal freedoms, and ensure that all people live under the protection of the law. Now, as you've heard today, the foundations of English liberty can be traced back to Magna Carta, but over time that principle evolved through key events and legal milestones. We had the Petition of Right in 1628, which sets out the specific rights of English citizens, including no taxation without parliamentary consent, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and no quartering of soldiers in private homes. We have the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, which strengthened the ancient writ of habeas corpus, ensuring that a court must examine the legality of anybody who's imprisoned. Then, of course, there was famously the Bill of Rights, which came around at the end of the Stuarts' reign, which significantly limited the rights of the monarchy, prevented them from suspending laws or levying taxes without parliamentary consent, or indeed maintaining a standing army during peacetime. Then you get parliamentary supremacy. That was the act which essentially made Parliament the supreme law-making source of the country, not the monarchy. And the Bill of Rights also, of course, guaranteed civil liberties and rights, including freedom of speech and debate in Parliament, the right to petition the government, and the right to bear arms for self-defense, something which we've lost over here, but remains in America, which is an inheritor of much of that, as well as protection from bails, fines, and cruel and unusual punishments. And I mention America importantly because the most profound achievement of English liberty wasn't what happened within England necessarily, but the fact that it was exported globally. It transcended national boundaries. In 1608, there was a very famous law case called Calvin's case, which determined that Scots, born after King James VI and I united the two kingdoms, Scots were therefore eligible for English rights and for English liberties. And that had a very far-reaching concept because the Americans then latched on to this idea of the rights of Englishmen, even though they were living in America. The colonists of the 13 colonies, who of course were Englishmen, as I like to say, a band of Englishmen throwing off a German king, the colonists in the 13 colonies believed that they were entitled to exactly the same legal rights as was the case for their brethren in Britain. Tensions began to rise, obviously, over the issue of taxation without representation in the House of Commons, a violation of their English liberties. The Magna Carta and all the things I've just described to you, those were driving forces pushing the Americans towards independence. And of course, many people in England were also sympathetic to the cause. People like John Wilkes and other Whig politicians supported the American Revolution because they saw that those English liberties were being threatened in the colonies. And what did the US Constitution do then? It formalized the rights that the British government had refused to extend to the colonies. In fact, one of the founding fathers, George Mason, said, "We claim nothing but the liberty and privileges of Englishmen in the same degree as if we had continued to live amongst our brethren in Great Britain." That's number one. Now, number two is also connected to liberty, and that's England's status as the other birthplace of democracy. Greece obviously is the home of democracy, but England can justifiably claim to be the birthplace of the two forms of democratic government that dominate in the world today. One is obviously the Westminster parliamentary model, but the second one is the presidential model of government created by the Americans, but which is based upon English principles. And it's quite remarkable when you think about it that most of the world's democracies are actually governed by English traditions of government. Now, we're all familiar with the Westminster system of government, obviously, where you have a head of state. It could be a king, but it could also be a parliamentary president, as you have in India and elsewhere, who embodies executive power. You have a head of government, who is a premier or a prime minister or a first minister, and carries the support of the majority of the members of parliament. And then you have an executive branch, a cabinet, who was selected from the legislature. So the executive and the legislature are both in Parliament, and they have cabinet responsibility. And then you have an independent civil service who are permanent, well, allegedly independent, I should say, who are permanent and implement the decisions of the government, whatever party is in power. And then, very importantly, also a parliamentary opposition. Now, also, in our system, you can dissolve Parliament by the snap of your fingers. Now, this has gone across the world, and the origins of it obviously were in London, going back actually to the 13th centuries. And if you look, even the ceremonies and rituals that you see, particularly in the former British colonies, closely resemble what happened in England in English history, and they have been exported to places like Kenya and all over Asia and elsewhere. Now, the presidential system of government, the second most common form of government, developed, of course, by the Americans after the American Revolution in the United States Constitutional Convention of 1787, but it was inspired by the system of government in place in colonial times in America under the English. The Pilgrims who came from England set up the Plymouth Colony, and as well as being inspired by the Plymouth Colony, they were inspired by English common law and English philosophers like John Locke. Now, America's form of presidential government went down to the Americas, and as America became more powerful, it expanded into Asia, into the Philippines, and globally. And so those two systems are the predominant systems in the world. You could also argue perhaps that the presidential systems come to the UK too via Tony Blair, who tried to shoehorn in the separation of powers in the Supreme Court into a system of government in which it was completely ill-suited. The third way England shaped the modern world is, of course, the English language. Now, in terms of native speakers, English ranks third behind Chinese and Spanish, but most speakers of those languages are essentially located just in two parts of the world, in the Americas and in China. If you factor in those for whom English is a second language, then English is by far the largest spoken language in the world and the most widespread geographically. There are 88 countries which have English as an official or administrative language, and up to 2 billion people speak English globally. It's the language of international government, of international trade, international finance, of business, of science, of technology, obviously of popular culture in the West, and the majority of internet communication. Now, the world tried to create an artificial lingua franca through the now terribly quaint Esperanto, which my grandfather tried to learn, but it failed. And to the utter annoyance of the French, English is the dominant lingua franca. And lingua franca is the language people of two different languages try to communicate in if they can't speak the same language. And that's even the case within the EU, which irritates the French even more, obviously. And I've actually long argued that we should carry on irritating them and we should change lingua franca to lingua anglia, after all, you know? Never before has it been easier for peoples of two different languages to communicate. Just 50 years ago, if a Bulgarian and a Korean wanted to speak, they'd have to engage a translator. Today, more often than not, they'd probably try to speak in English first. There's another reason also that English is the now global language, and that's because, of its simplicity. English is much easier to learn and has a much simpler grammar than many languages around the world. My mother's Polish, believe me. There was once a cartoon of God creating the world's languages with a Scrabble set, and at the end, all he had left were the W's and the Z's, and he said, And the adaptability of the English language. You know, we have the world's largest vocabulary, and we are very good at stealing words or absorbing words from other languages, so it's extremely versatile as well. So English obviously began to dominate the world because of the English, and then the British Empire, and then, of course, the expansion of America globally further embedded English around the world. But now I think it's got a life of its own as a genuine lingua franca, a real Esperanto, and it'll be curious to see how it develops in the decades to come. Now, the next one, probably waiting for me to cite already, the Industrial Revolution, of course. And many would say that that is actually England's single greatest impact on the world. And yes, people on YouTube, I do know about the Scots and the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution was born in England, and it occurred there because of England's unique qualities. And let's be clear here, the Industrial Revolution was the biggest leap forward in human history for 12,000 years. Not since man began to adopt agriculture in the Neolithic era had we seen such a leap forward in humanity. And the Industrial Revolution transformed almost every aspect of daily life, transforming societies from agrarian to industrial, but it brought in huge technological advancements, economic growth, urbanization, and it was thanks to the Industrial Revolution that the standard of living of the general population in the Western world began to increase consistently for the first time in history. Average incomes rose, and so too did the size of the population, quite dramatically. And in all of this, England had a huge head start. 1760 in England, it wasn't until around 1840 that it had reached all corners of America and continental Europe. Now, why did it start in England? Well, there are myriad reasons for that. First of all was another great English advance, and that was the great English agricultural revolution, which began in the mid-17th century and saw an unprecedented increase in agricultural production and productivity. That led to a surplus of food and a surplus of labor. So what are you going to do with these people who are just looking for work? Well, the Industrial Revolution gave jobs for them in the factories. Britain was also very lucky. It was blessed with natural resources, with coal and iron deposits, which you needed, of course, to power the machinery. Also, it was England's political stability. That was a very important part of why we had the Industrial Revolution, a stable political and legal framework which supported business, innovation, and created an environment where you actually could have economic growth. Added to which we had our empire. And having the empire gave us access to raw materials, as well as markets for manufactured goods and investment opportunities. And of course, technological innovation, entrepreneurship, hugely important as well. This culture of entrepreneurship was fostered through the Industrial Revolution, allowing British investors to essentially invest in new technologies. Now, linked to this somewhat, this is the most boring of them all, so have a snooze if you want to, this is capitalism. Capitalism is, I think, just as important in my view as the Industrial Revolution, because nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty than capitalism. It's the most powerful and successful economic system ever to have existed. And let me put it this way. In 1820, 94% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. By 1910, that had gone down to 82%. By 1950, it had dropped to 72%. But the largest decline in global poverty happened between 1981 and 2015, when it declined from 44% to 9.6%. Between 1990 and 2015, 1.25 billion people around the world escaped extreme poverty. That's 50 million people a year. Now, England wasn't the first country to embrace capitalism. Capitalism in its modern form you can trace back to the Italian city-states and the emergence of agrarian capitalism and mercantilism in places like Renaissance, Florence, and so forth. Similarly, the Dutch put capitalism onto steroids during its golden age when they pioneered many of the innovations that fueled capitalism later on, development of financial institutions like the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, establishing the whole idea of a stock market where you can essentially trade stocks and modern investment banking. But the modern form of industrial capitalism was an English invention born out of the Industrial Revolution. Investing in English technologies, long-term planning, and investment in manufacturing. These were central to building up British capitalism in the 19th century. The rise of the free market, again, hat tip to Adam Smith and the Scots with that. But free trade and the gold standard were promoted by England, which helped to establish a very stable and interconnected global financial system. And what happened then was that England became the center of the first ever global financial system, with London as the global hub for international trade and investment. That gave rise to something called financial state capitalism, where England's success in establishing this global financial system enabled the British state to then get involved in managing the economy in various macroeconomic ways. And then, of course, we had our huge empire and the might of the Industrial Revolution, through which Britain was able to spread capitalism globally, essentially by imposing capitalism on new markets around much of the world. And in finance too, England and the Bank of England led the way. I don't know how many of you are aware, but checks, banknotes, overdrafts, clearing houses, the modern merchant bank and the high street bank, all invented in England. Right, the next one we're going to talk about is linked again to that, and that's the British Empire. Now, yes, it is the British Empire. However, the origins are English, and indeed it was Scotland's attempt to copy the English Empire that led to it embarking upon its disastrous Darien scheme, by which it sought to establish a colony in Panama, and the failure of that is what led the Scots to try to enter the Act of Union of 1707. And whilst the Scots did play a hugely important role in the expansion of the British Empire, the empire was the means by which England's greatest gifts, including those we've discussed today, were exported globally. English liberty and democracy, the Westminster model, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, the railways, everything you want to talk about. Without the British Empire, England would not have made the modern world to the same degree. Similarly, the British Empire saw the greatest leap forward in the lives of colonial subjects, medicine and hospitals, education through schools and universities, the infrastructure, the railways, the roads, the sewage systems, creating military, creating a civil service, the police. Remember also the first modern police forces are English, the London Marine Police Force and the London Metropolitan Police Force. And crucially also, the outlawing of abhorrent cultural practices. It was the British who banned suttee, the burning of Hindu widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands. It was the British who outlawed infanticide in India, the murder of young girls, who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. It was the British who stopped the headhunting in New Zealand, who tried to stop SGM in East Africa. And of course, the enforcement of the end of slavery, because remember, there were more slaves kept in Africa by other Africans than were ever transported over the ocean, and it was the British government, along with the French, who had to actively enforce an end to the slave trade in Africa, because Africans were actually some of those who were most vehemently opposed to the end of the slave trade. Coming at number 7, we have the railways and also urban mass transit. So England is the birthplace of the railways. And again, to all the Cornish nationalists, I do know the first locomotive was invented by a Cornishman, but I'm still pretty sure he's English as well. Now, railways obviously revolutionized the world. They led to standardized time within Britain, but also within each nation that adopted the railways. They needed to run trains according to set timetables. Perhaps most importantly, they united nations. They helped to connect different parts of countries, contributing to the development of national identity and unity. Without the railways, it's hard to imagine India having come into existence in the way that it did. The Trans-Canada Railway was critical to Canadian Confederation, and likewise, it was railways that enabled the Americans to fulfill their manifest destiny. Economically, it reduced transportation costs, which of course also stimulated economic and industrial growth. It lowered prices for goods, which also stimulated customer demand. But importantly, it improved people's diet, because perishable foods could now be moved quickly around the country. Fish, vegetables, dairy products could now reach the market while they were fresh. They also opened up new national and international markets, and the railways led to urban growth and development, helping to connect cities and industrial centers. We saw population growth coming as a result, and urbanization. Similarly, mass transit transformed urbanization and created today's modern cities. The invention of the London Underground, the world's first underground mass transit system, paved the way for the megacities of today, and of course, London was the world's first megacity. It was the London Underground that enabled the development of suburbia far from the center of town, because before that it was impossible to work in town and live beyond a couple of miles away. And today, most of the world's population live in cities where they depend on that very same mass transit. Politically, the railways were important because they helped to spread political ideas. Activists could travel the country, political pamphlets could be spread around the nation as never before. Similarly, in response to that, quite often, the government could actually send troops by railway, which they couldn't before, to quell rebellions and so forth much faster than was previously possible. And then you had the social and cultural impact of the railways that led to people leaving their hometown, leaving their regions for the first time and traveling the length and breadth of the country. That led to a breakdown in stereotypes as they intermixed with people from very different communities. You had, for the first time, people going on leisure holidays, the rise of tourism, of the tourism industry. National newspapers could be delivered on the same day or at least weekly, which meant for the first time people were finding out about events almost as soon as they happened. It was the beginning of our current global village. And national sports could be organized, because now finally sports teams could actually go and compete against one another. England's 9th great contribution is English Protestantism and the Reformation. Now, if you're an atheist or a Catholic or a non-Christian, you might scoff at that. But it's undeniable that Protestantism was a direct cause of the rise of individualism and literacy, two of the key factors underlying the success of the Anglosphere. The most advanced, most free and most successful nations are the Anglosphere nations. And if you look at rankings of the world's most individualistic nations, it's quite clear. The world's most individualistic nation is the United States of America, then it's Canada, then it's Australia, then it's New Zealand, then it's the UK, then it's the Scandinavian nations, which obviously are also Protestant. Protestantism removed the priest as an intermediary between God and the person. therefore encouraging people to develop their own personal relationship with God, to reject the Catholic Church hierarchy, and importantly, acquire personal responsibility, religious autonomy, freedom of belief, and individual conscience. And that was a major milestone in the development of individualism. And to achieve that, the Protestants promoted literacy so that people could read the Bible themselves and in their native language. In England, the level of Protestant church hierarchy diminished each time you got a new iteration of Protestantism. From Anglicanism, which still maintained some hierarchy, to Presbyterianism. Then you got the free and nonconformist churches, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Quakers, all the way down to the Shakers and the Anabaptists. And that had far-reaching impacts. Just think about what happened in the English Civil War. It was religious tensions and the fear of a popish plot or a popish king coming to the throne that led directly to the Glorious Revolution, the Bill of Rights, and the English liberties we've just been discussing. America's Puritan origins have shaped a huge amount of its character, its history, its values, its outlook on the world. And whether or not you subscribe to Max Weber's Protestant work ethic, it's undeniable that the unequal prosperity of the Protestant nations was tied to their strong work ethic and their entrepreneurial spirit. Now, you can agree or disagree with Max Weber's theory, but I think it's clear that the work and business culture in those countries was radically different to that found in non-Protestant nations. And one last point about English Protestantism is the positive impact it had on civic society and the national conscience, especially in the 19th century. As we've just said, Protestantism was a driving force behind the abolition of slavery, but it also gave rise to a voluntary and philanthropic ethic in Britain and in the British Dominions, in Canada and Australia, and also in the US, that I think is without equal in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, the number of charitable organizations set up in England at this time was unprecedented. You had the Salvation Army, you had the Boy Scouts, Dr. Barnardo's, Elizabeth Fry Society, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, St. John's Ambulance, the Boys Brigade, the RSPCA, the RSPCB, Battersea Dogs Home. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. That is something which you don't find equaled in any other culture at that time, and that was exported around the Anglosphere thanks to their English inheritance. And now you'll be relieved to know we're at number 10, and how England made the modern world, and it's sport. Now, sport you may think is a rather frivolous topic to add in there, but actually it is a vital part of England's contribution to global civilization. And this was acknowledged actually in 2012 at the London opening ceremonies of the Olympics by the head of the IOC, who said that this country is the birthplace of modern sport, and that our approach to sport, with the concepts of sportsmanship and fair play, and decency and codified rules and regulations, influenced Baron Pierre de Coubertin when he started the very first modern Olympic Games. And of course, England was home to the Paralympic Games as well. Because the truth is, no country in the world comes anywhere close to the number of sports that England either invented or codified in modern forms. It's just a shame we don't ever win any of them, but... Again, hat tip to the Scots for inventing curling and golf, we'll give you that. But in their modern forms, football, boxing, tennis, cricket, rugby, hockey, baseball, table tennis, netball, rounders, modern polo, bowls, snooker, darts were either created or codified by the English and became a central plank of the school curriculum, where they encouraged cooperation and teamwork, instilled English concepts of fair play, sportsmanship, and discipline. And the Victorians knew very well too, and were counting on, that sports also provided an outlet for young men and perhaps colonial subjects to exhaust their physical and mental energy, which otherwise might have been spent on crime or immorality, as well as protest and political unrest. And with an almost missionary zeal, these sports and the values of sportsmanship and discipline were exported and spread throughout the British Empire and subsequently the wider world. Now, why does that matter? Well, organized national sport is a key component for forging national identity and strengthening social cohesion. I mean, who can deny the power of a World Cup victory? Nothing unites peoples of a nation quite like a nation competing in international fixtures, especially once they get to the final stages. In republics like America, there is no equivalent to sport, aside from perhaps the 4th of July, but just think about the Super Bowl and what it means to Americans. In monarchies, sports has no equivalent apart from the coronation or a state funeral, although even those now have less emotional resonance than in previous decades. So anyway, there we have it. Those are the 10 ways in which I believe England has made the modern world. There are many other contributions I could have made, too many to enumerate here. Certainly, I think it's remarkable, though, that one nation should be responsible for the two most significant developments in the past 12,000 years, the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. That alone sets England and Britain apart. But if you take all those 10 together, plus the others we haven't talked about, it's hard for me to see how one can't come to the conclusion that England has been the most significant and influential country, at least of the past 1,000 years. Now, we live in an era where our culture and our history are under sustained attack. Almost every day we see another story that seemingly sets out to demoralize the English and the British people by undermining our heritage, undermining our identity, and indeed all that we hold dear. We see our heroes are denigrated, our statues are pulled down, streets and buildings are renamed. We're told that this nation has no reason to be proud because it's achieved nothing, and along with the West, it is the root of all evil. I hope I've demonstrated that they couldn't be further from the truth. So let me leave you. I started with Churchill, I'll end with Churchill. One of my favorite sayings of Churchill is quite simply, "There is a forgotten, nay, almost forbidden word, which means more to me than any other. That word is England." Thank you.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals program, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.